Do the gods look like us? Do we look like the gods? How come they look certain ways in the tales and in the stories that we have handed down? If we're talking about Odin, he's described in a number of different ways. His Hall of Valhalla is described as having this boar in it that as meat is taken off this boar and eaten every night, it regrows back. There is, endless mead and the Einherjar. They are warriors that fight with each other all day, injure each other, even kill each other. Then they drink together in Valhalla in preparation for Ragnarok, and they talk about the battles they had that day and their exploits until a certain time. So there's certain, and Odin is described as the hooded one, Grimnir. He's described as Sigfader, father of victory. He's described as Allfather, father of the gods. Wodenaz means frenzy. He's described in a number of different ways. What a lot of these ways are getting at is a kind of strands of impossibility made possible because they are strands that more exist in the astral realms, more exist in these realms beyond the material. These strands of possibility that they can tweak. They can of course tweak how they look, and they manifest various powers because those strands of possibility can also do that. Loki is described as being more chaotic and having more forms. It's almost like it's hinting at strands of possibility that are like unstable, or strands of weird that are unstable or more chaotic. It's almost like weird magic, whatever you want to call it, the stuff of impossibility, these strands of impossibility that they work with. It's almost like they can exist in various degrees of order and chaos. And Loki's, his strands are specifically more chaotic than the Aesir. And we know Loki is Jotnar. We know that Thor is half Jotun and half Jotun, half Earth, because Odin mated with the Earth to make Thor to protect the Earth and to kind of like seal a deal with the Earth. Because this goes kind of back to marriage and how clans intermarry and create alliances through marriage. So is that something that they actually do, or is that something that we're putting on the gods, that we are personifying the gods and trying to make them into a form that looks like us? Kind of yes and no, I think. These are just my thoughts. I could be wrong about everything. These are just my contemplations based on what I've read and based on personal gnosis. And a lot of these symbols, while they might have actual like manifestation, I think that a lot of it sounds so impossible because it's strands of impossibility, strands of energy that don't exist in a material way as we would usually think of them. And another reason is because it's almost like the gods know that they can only connect to us in ways that we understand. And it's almost like they're meeting us halfway with a lot of these things. But also, back to personal gnosis, a lot of these symbols, once you reach various levels of realization, you're like, oh, that's what this means. That's what the boar in Odin's Hall means. That's what the shape of Thor's hammer is. It wasn't just a shape of convenience for smiths to make that would represent Thor. This is what it actually is. And that's where personal gnosis comes in. And that's why a lot of these stories have strands of personal gnosis. They have strands of personification, personifying the gods like us. And then they have strands of impossibility that can't quite exist here. And that's trying to be communicated. So we have this jumble of information. We have this jumble of qualities of the gods that we have to make sense of and make a coherent picture of them through. And there is that egregor aspect of, if you relate to this god a certain way for long enough, or if you believe in them in this way for long enough, their strands of impossibility react. The weird reacts, their strands reacts to how we perceive them. It's almost like, when scientists look at electrons, that they actually change their behavior once they're being observed. I don't know the science behind it. I just know that's what in quantum physics they talk about that a lot, that things change when you observe them. it's almost like those electrons are the smallest strands of possibility blinking in and out of existence, forming a more tangible matter in groupings that we can see as everything around us. Loki's children, Hel and the serpent, Fenrir, Jormungandr, the serpent. Fenrir is a giant wolf. They seem especially chaotic because not only is it Loki's strands of chaos, he's mating with other Jotun that make it more chaotic. And when Odin conquered Ymir with his brothers, Vili and Ve, he had to conquer this grander chaos and form it into things, make it into order so that things could exist in the material realm. Form these strands of possibility into a coherence where existence could happen and maintain while our souls are working through it. Just my ideas. I'm not saying that this is canon for anybody. And it does make sense that Loki would be more chaotic and want to return everything back to that chaos because he's more of that chaos than a being like Odin. Thor, how he's depicted in movies is really interesting because in the Thor movies he's thin, he's cut, except for maybe the one where he gets fat at the end, but how he's described in the sagas is having a really big belly and long red hair. Not anybody's current idea of beauty, but back then it might have been more of a staple. And weight, fat can represent muscle, but it can also represent a bounty, like he's connected to the earth itself. Now, all these gods can, of course, form themselves in various forms and look various ways. They're even described as being various creatures. So it's confusing when people get hung up on for instance, in one of the Thor movies, Heimdall was black in the Thor movie. And people got hung up on that, like we're trying to rewrite history or something like that. But that's all of these impossible things are described for these gods. And the hang up of Heimdall being black, that doesn't even make any sense, especially when Heimdall is the one that, created the races of man through mating, like all the races. And I think we have to be careful of wanting the gods to look a certain ethnicity, like wanting them to be they came from a white area, so they should look white. That is basically glorifying the thinnest possible thing that these gods are, and wanting to attach ourselves to them, make us more venerable because they came from a white area. Of course they're going to be white. It's more of a system of glorifying ethnocentricity or how people look and the color of their skin. I think that's missing the whole point of the gods altogether. And just to bring in Christianity a little bit, in the Bible, I haven't read this particular part. I've read most of the Bible, but I haven't read this particular part. But I've listened to priests talk about how the angel described all these different eyes on this globe that has wings, and which it's funny because they look more like Greek gods later on. Once the pagan world becomes Christian, they just take how the Greek gods looked and they just put them onto angels and Jesus and God. God looks like Zeus, but these strands of impossibility exist in many different traditions. The Hebrew idea of angels, for instance, being these weird creatures makes more sense because it's a different realm. They're not made up of the same stuff we are. They're not bound by the same things we are. They don't need we don't need the same amount of limbs. They don't need the same quality of senses. And a lot of it's also symbolic, like being able to perceive in all directions. Like Brahma is described as having heads that look in all directions. And there's many Brahmas, turtles all the way down, Brahmas with more and more heads. A lot of this is symbolic, but it also speaks to the strands of impossibility, the strands of weird, and the ability of gods to be various things, but also the realization that their existence should kind of confound us. And the confounding part is part of divinity itself. And we can't get too caught up on material assignments to gods as far as how they look and what their skin color is, things like that. It's missing the whole point. description of the description of gods like Freya, the Vanir, basically elven gods, very connected to nature. A lot of the symbolism and a lot of the statues are a lot of these things are carved with all this. The rune stones are dedicated to them, are carved with all these very nature-like symbols, and perhaps their qualities are more life-oriented, but it's the impossibility strands in life. It's the weird in life. It's the weird in nature that's trying to personify it. It's not that they adore these particular symbols or these Celtic flowing things. It's trying to get at a deeper truth. It's trying to get at the truth of the proliferation of life. That's why we have to be careful. And the runes, the Elder Futhark, they are obviously in forms that are easy to carve, but they're not given, the physical personification of like a person, because they're even more strands of impossibility. Their names are more like them than their particular symbols. The symbols are what we had to work with, but the names and the variation of language itself, how we weave it, how we tell stories with it. It's almost like we're grabbing those little strands of impossibility and weaving them. And I think that the spoken word gets closer to that than pictures do or images do. And I think when Odin sacrificed himself to himself, that's an inward soul journey. Do we think that there was a literal tree that he hung himself from? That he actually hung himself through Yggdrasil? Does Yggdrasil look like a tree? Maybe, but I think there's enough strands of impossibility and strangeness and deeper meaning that we shouldn't try to fit everything into the physical representation of things. I think that we're missing the point when we do that. We're not hitting anywhere close to divinity in our conception of it when we do that. Do the gods look like us? They can. Do they confine themselves to that 100% of the time? I don't see why they would, especially when they can take various forms. They might favor various forms because when they're dealing with us. Maybe all the souls that go to Valhalla, maybe they only see Odin in a form that they would recognize. But once again, we're using our perception, our physical eyes, to try to assign certain images. Whereas these beings see, hear, and all their senses are in each of their senses. This is, in Hindu description of the astral realm. When you reach a higher level, it's not just like a temporary heaven or a temporary hell. When you actually graduate to another level, all your senses are in each sense. You can see with your nose, for instance, things like that, and it gets into this more perfect and absolute perception that we don't quite understand and that we can't conceptualize or even imagine because we are confined. And we should not imagine that the prisons in which we are confined dictate the forms of the universe, the multiverse. That's where we have to be careful. But yeah, to answer the question and to kind of end this, do the gods look like us? They can. But they don't have to. And I doubt that they do all the time. At any rate, thank you very much for watching. Hit that like button down there. It really helps out the channel. Feel free to leave a comment. That also helps out the channel. And feel free to share this video wherever you like. At any rate, thank you very much for watching, and I hope all of you have a wonderful day.